Hello, dear listeners. Happy Thanksgiving. We're coming at you today with a special holiday bonus, continuing in our sort of, we could say, mini Bolaño-verse episode run. I'm very happy to present this episode that was recorded with friend of the pod, Anna, about Roberto Bolaño's Savage Detectives. Now, this is kind of a little bit different from what we usually do. I did not reread the book for this episode, but Anna just finished it. This is kind of like a reaction episode, and we go through the whole book. We just kind of talk about the whole thing, so definitely spoilers if anyone is waiting to read Savage Detectives. But I think this is a pretty good episode for why the book is so good, why we both like Bolaño, and a kind of like bigger counterpoint episode to the episodes John and I do on sort of the smaller Bolaños. So this is one of my all-time favorite books, and as you can tell by the conversation, I think one of Anna's newly all-time favorite books. So I had a great time recording this episode, and we at the Infinite Library Podcast wish you all happy holidays, and you'll be hearing from us soon for our Shaban episode, which will be coming not long after this one. So we hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, listeners, to a special episode of the Infinite Library Podcast. So this episode is going to be a little bit different. Usually when John and I do our episodes, we tend to kind of do a review, sort of like a preparatory. We do some preparation, obviously, and then we do the episode. This is going to be kind of in the nature of like a first reaction, just sort of a general talk about Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño, maybe one of my favorite books of all time. And I'm joined by friend of the pod, Anna, for today.
Hi, Ben.
Anna, it's always good to have you. You were great on the Juna Barnes episode. I'm glad you're here to talk Savage Detectives. So you just finished it.
Just finished it, like last night. Less than 24 hours ago.
Yeah, less than 24 hours ago. How does it feel?
It feels good. I thought, okay, this book took forever for me to read too. Like consistently reading long. For like a month. It's long. When I was thinking about this earlier today, when I was reading it and when I finished it, I was just like, I was so ready to be finished with it. I was like, I just want to finish it. And now that I'm finished with it, I'm like, I kind of wish I wasn't.
Yeah, because like in the middle where everyone's kind of telling their stories, it sort of fans out like endlessly, and you're like, oh, it could just keep going on like this, and really then then it like kind of has to end when it circles back to the beginning. So
yeah, I think the way it ends also has to deal with that. So this book is set up in a very brilliant way, which I really like. But just to give some context, so the first part of the book is sort of like an outrageous campus novel.
Yeah.
And it goes through like kind of like a kind of diary entry of a guy named Garcia Madero. And then it goes all the way up to New Year's of 1976. And then it pivots into this really brilliant interview format.
Yeah. All of these voices kind of like commenting on these characters that we've only kind of seen through the eyes of the first person in the first part. And suddenly we get these characters from like various other perspectives.
Yeah, there's something, I wish I had counted how many different characters there are. There have to be like at least 20. That's probably even a conservative estimate too.
Yeah, there are quite a few. I actually was looking at the number just briefly before we hopped on, and I believe it's more than 40, which is also not very specific. But yeah, there's quite a few characters in this interview portion, which is like I would say the bulk of the book.
Yeah, and then at the very end, the last like 50 pages, you return back to this first person diary narrative. and you close out back in that first person of Garcia Madero. Madero? I'd have to look at his name.
And like in that first person campus novel, it's sort of like his kind of coming to age of like poetry, and sort of like he loses his virginity and he meets this like sort of gang of poets like in Mexico City. And then they sort of end up going to the Sonoran Desert to find this like long lost poet, right? I can't remember her name.
Cesaria Tenherio.
Yeah, Cesario Tenherio. And then they find her, and she gets like tragically, well, spoilers, she gets like tragically killed, right? Because they're being chased by like, I think a cop and like a violent prostitute, I think. Or no, yes. Not a violent prostitute, a violent pimp. Yeah.
It is one of the most like horrific. Yeah, the last 50 pages are horrific. We'll just full on spoil it. So they spend all this time looking for Cesaria, and they find her, and then like immediately after, this pimp that is following them, they get into a fight and she gets shot like almost immediately and dies. I don't think they even really get to ask her anything. Like
yeah.
And they go on like this huge journey to find her, and just immediately there's nothing. They don't find any more of her poetry. They don't get to ask her about anything.
There's no answer, or like there's no center to the labyrinth. Like with Bolaño is like people will start doing things and then they just kind of like lose themselves in whatever they're doing, and there's no like, I don't know, center explanatory moment. Like Cesaria doesn't tell them anything. There is, I think, references to 2666 when they see her, but they're only like hints. I don't think it's like the explanatory thing that the characters like think she's gonna tell them.
Yeah. So yeah, going back to the start, because really the start is really delightful and does a really good job of pulling you in. So yeah, you follow. Let me see if I can find his name. I think it's Madero. Madero. There is like 40 characters.
Yeah, there's a lot of Juan Garcia Madero 1D.
Madero. Okay.
Yeah.
There he is. Yeah. And it is also, I should note, it's easy to forget his name because as soon as you switch out of the first person narrative, he does not show up again at all. He gets mentioned once in the entire like middle section of the book.
Does it say what happens to him? Because like he's sort of this up and coming poet, and then the narrative shifts to sort of like the center of this poet group. Does it like talk about what happens? Because I honestly can't remember like when he gets mentioned again.
No, he doesn't really say what happens to him. So he gets mentioned again right before we go back to his first person, and they're talking to. It's like I think it's in the 1996 section. But they're talking to, what is his name? Ernesto Garcia Grajales, who has become a leading expert on the visceral realists.
Oh yeah, the sort of, isn't he like an academic type kind of?
Yeah, he's like an academic from the university, and he's doing this project on the visceral realists. And he's even like kind of flippant about it because he's like, let me do it, and if it doesn't like pick up, we'll just talk about some of the more popular ones. It's fine. But whoever, you never really know who's interviewing them. That's never revealed. But in that narrative, they it seems like the narrative leads you to think that they had asked about Garcia Madero. And this academic is like, no, I have no idea who that is. That's not a visceral realist. I have no idea who that kid is. I've never heard of him.
Yeah, who's this guy? Yeah.
Who is this guy?
Yeah.
Like they list off like all the other visceral realists, and then he's like, Garcia Madero? No, I have no idea. He never belonged to the group.
Yeah, that's like, it's like kind of tragic.
Yeah, it is tragic because like So I guess the visceral realists are like like a sort of anarchist, but not really avant-garde poetry group that's led by Arturo Bolaño and Ulysses Lima, who are Roberto Bolaño and Santiago. I don't remember what Santiago's first name is. It's in the introduction.
Yeah, his very close friend. Yeah, what is Mario Papasquiaro, Santiago Papasquiaro.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're like the center, and they run a literary magazine called Lee Harvey Oswald, which they fund via selling marijuana. And they're loosely based on the movement Bolaño was associated called the Infrarealists. And they're sort of like avant-garde assholes, kind of, and they hate Octavia Paz. Their sworn enemy, Octavia Paz, probably because he's sort of like the state like poet, like he's the national Mexican poet, and they're like, "Fuck that establishment guy." Like,
they really hate Octavia Paz.
Yeah, our sworn enemy, or they refer to him as like the sworn enemy, or that like sellout, like a lot of negative epithets for Octavia Paz.
A lot of which is funny. You were telling me, so hang on. So the visceral realists show up. They attend one lecture that Garcia Madero is at. They show up in one lecture, and Garcia lets himself just be completely thrown off course. He meets them once and he's like, I'm not going to college classes anymore. I'm just going to hang out in all these seedy bars.
Yeah, and don't they like kind of mercilessly mock the teacher? Isn't it sort of like the students take control of the classroom kind of like scenario?
It's mostly just Garcia. He just like keeps asking him about like poetic forms, and because the professor can't name what the poetic forms are, he's just like, this professor sucks. He doesn't know anything.
Yeah. So, okay. So I had a question for you. So one of the things Bolaño likes to do is like have characters recite lists of information, and like the way they're presented is like the character clearly is invested in the information, which is why they're listing it. But like the average reader would be like, why am I getting all of this? And he does it like frequently in many of his books. What did you think about Madero's tendency to just quote poetic forms and like definitions like endlessly?
You know, for the most part, like it was kind of like almost funny. There is one section that drove me crazy, and I think it literally just is listing out the names of every single Mexican poet, and it goes on for pages. I don't even think it's every Mexican poet. I think it's just like a huge list of poets, and it goes on for like pages, and I was like, what is happening? What is this?
Yeah, so like that's like I could see that as like Bolaño being like, I need to remember every single poet because every single poet is important to me, but also like this character needs to sort of demonstrate that they know all of this for whatever specific reason. I was almost just kind of like, oh, you just flexing that you know all this shit. Like, well, isn't there a scene where they're just like in the stakeout car section in part 3 when they're waiting for something to happen, and Madero just starts saying, do you know what this form is? You know what that form is? Yeah. And he's just like, and like they're just killing time. Also, one thing we haven't talked about is Ulysses is constantly reading, and I love that in the stakeout scene he's like reading a book in the car during this like really tense scenario. And then there's also a scene later where somebody mentions that he reads books in the shower. So, like,
yes. Yeah. I think that's in the Tel Aviv section, but yeah, he like reads books in the shower, and the person's just like, okay.
It's just such a funny detail that he's like that dedicated that he's just like in the shower, like holding the book, probably like outside of the shower, like reading it or something. Like,
oh my god. Yeah, I think the person notices because the books are like wet, and they're like, why are the books wet?
Oh man, this is so good.
Like, sticking it out, like I've only just pictured him just reading it in the shower and just not care.
Yeah, all the pages are stuck together. Whatever.
Oh my god. Yeah, but it is a nice little symmetry. So in the beginning of the first section, we're listing out all these poetic forms. And in the beginning of the third section, we are once again listing out all these poetic forms.
Huh, nice.
Which
so you kind of know
nice
like you're
little...
like something's kind of closing. Yeah. Because Bolaño loves to do that. Like in the Third Reich, the guy's like obsessed with board game moves. And in obviously in 2666, it's like authors, but also like people that were killed, the women that were killed mysteriously in Sonora. Like he sort of obsessively catalogs all of their details. And like in I know there's another one. Oh yeah, and then in the one that we covered on the pod, By Night in Chile, like that guy lists all of the Greeks out as a way of like not dealing with the revolution. When he's just like, then I read this Greek author, then I read that one, and like the revolution is happening, and he's like, I'm not involved.
Time went by.
Yeah.
Oh, so Garcia, little weirdo.
Yeah, very much so.
All of this, there's a lot of sex stuff in this book, and it's all really weird.
It is all really weird. Yeah, it is really weird because like he clearly is like, I want to put sex in here, but it's like, yeah, it's strange. So
it's like borderline Murakami-esque, like not. I get, well, Murakami-esque would be more that like weird stuff happened to them while they were having sex, but it's that same sort of like unconvincing that you know what's happening.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read much Murakami.
I did read the like 1Q84, and I remember the like the sex scenes very like very technically described. Like if like it's very like a lot of technical sexual descriptions that like I don't think we're supposed to be kind of erotic. And I feel like Bolaño is like a little more erotic than Murakami, but at the same time it's like still really weird. So
yeah. I was reading this book. I got summoned for jury duty, and when they were sitting me in a little room to make me wait to see if I would be on a case, I was reading this book next to this woman who was also reading a book, but she kept looking over at me, and I kept being in a section with really weird sex scenes in it, and I kept being like, please don't read this. Please don't read this.
Was that the one where like at some point Madero and another character like realized that S&M sex is a thing? like I feel like there's like it's like both Madero and a character in the second section, the fanning out, like both have a realization that you can have like S&M during sex, and it's like this like light bulb moment for both of them. Like it's interesting that he kind of chose to focus on that. Like these like Madero is like learning how poetry works and how like literature works, but he's also like learning about sex. He's like, he learns a lot of stuff in that like opening section.
He does. He loses his virginity in this section
to the hot sisters. Yeah,
to the hot sisters.
Well, one of the sisters, but yeah.
After he read a poem, and it made him so horny.
Which I told you this. So the poem is like a vampire sex poem, and he gets extremely horny, and it's by some French author in the book. But it's actually a poem by Octavia Paz. Like Bolaño, like basically he wanted to give like, to me, that's like a hint from Bolaño that he actually likes Octavia Paz. Cause like Bolaño loves everything that he thinks is good literature, which is like almost everything. But like, he's like, Octavia Paz is like actually pretty cool. But since my characters hate him, I have to make the vampire poem by some like mysterious Frenchman or something. Like, so.
Right. God. Yeah, so he reads this vampire poem. It makes him so horny. He like masturbates to it, but it makes him so horny that like 2 days later, he's just sitting. Well, so first of all, it makes him so horny. He's like, oh, poetry is it, which I think he was already interested in poetry, but he was like, oh my God. And he's like, immediately he's like, I need to lose my virginity. And then he's sitting on a bench like 2 days later, and he just thinks about the poem, and he gets like an erection so bad that he has to like sit there and stare at like a rat scrambling around for like 20 minutes, and then he has to walk around.
And is it like kind of like disgusting? Like I remember, like isn't the rat like described like disgust? Like it's like this like disgusting like animal scene, kind of like like. I saw a cap on Twitter. Somebody was reading Savage Detectives, and they capped that part, and the caption was, "Is this what being a boy is like, or something?" Just like being terminally horny and seeing like an ugly rat.
Oh my God.
Oh man,
he's like stuck there. He's like, this is such a horrible, ugly scene, but I can't stand up.
You know, he also, I actually reread this, or I read this year Distant Star, and there's a bit in Distant Star where the character is in a poetry workshop with two very attractive sisters, but he never ends up like doing anything with them. But I think that's kind of like a continual scene for Bolaño, is like the young poet in the workshop and there's two hot sisters, and like maybe he gets involved with them, maybe he doesn't, but that was in Distant Star.
Okay. Yeah, I had not really. I feel like I read a little bit more than average, like South American literature. I had not heard about Bolaño until you did the podcast episode, and then I read By Night in Chile like right after that episode came out, and then like a week later, I was out with like Dan doing something, and I saw Savage Detectives in a used bookstore, and I was like, yep.
That was the time. Yeah. So I actually had heard about Bolaño and had read, I think I was thinking about this because I know we were going to talk about it. I read 2666 before Savage Detectives, and I was like, that's pretty cool, but I wasn't blown away. And then I read Savage Detectives, and I felt like I'd gotten like electrocuted. And I was like, I love this book. I want to start a zine. I love literature. Like it was like the sort of the experience Maduro has with the sex poem. It was me reading Savage Detectives, and then I went back and like tried to read as much as I could, and I reread 2666. But like, I don't know why, it just Savage Detectives hit me at like the right moment, and then I had to start a zine, and so then I did, and it didn't end as disastrously as it does in Savage Detectives. But there is something kind of like, I think, and like I did want to mention this briefly. I think the cool thing about Bolaño is that like he really does think reading and writing is like the shit, like everything you should be doing. But he also realizes that it's like doomed to failure. Like the poets are doomed to be forgotten. The poems are doomed to not be read. Like there's something sort of like, at the same time, he's like, this is amazing. He also realizes that it has like a lot of shortcomings, and it's no equal to like actually living or doing things. And so there's like this interesting balance to me, which makes it like so much fun, but also like gives sort of like the tragedy like of Maduro being forgotten by like that sort of, you know, grim, whatever, academic who's going to do a survey of them or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the crux of the whole thing. Like the whole novel is just kind of this is important and this is awesome, but also like this career doesn't really lead anywhere. And if you do not make it, like Octavio Paz,
yeah,
or Neruda, you're going to be, you know, forgotten, and it's going to waste your life away. Although a lot of this is their own fault.
Yeah, because they are kind of assholes, right? Like,
they are assholes.
Yeah.
There are assholes, and they do refuse to get jobs. So like,
yeah. Yeah, they don't get real jobs, and like, so yeah, most of the second section is like Bolaño and Arturo Bolaño and Lima just kind of wandering around Europe, like being kind of bums. Like, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we should get into the second section.
We can. I'm trying to think if there was something else I wanted to mention from the first one. I think what's cool about the first one also is the last thing I'll say is that like there's a kind of I would say like attraction in seeing that Maduro like understand how everything works, because you might be like, oh, I also remember that, but also like he learns a bunch of stuff, people tell him about things, and there's kind of a cool like introduction to this world that you, the reader, are getting, and also the character is getting, and it feels like it's exciting, almost so much so that like when you hit the second section, to me initially it was almost like a disappointment, like, oh, we're not going to get to hang out with Maduro for another 400 pages, but then like I quickly got involved with the second one and I left him behind. But like there's a real sort of like a pull to his character that I think is super cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. The first section is so charming. And you get familiar with all the characters through his eyes, and you learn things like as he learns them about them. There's also like, there's so much outrageous, hilarious stuff. There's a really charming section where there are actually a lot of like gay characters in this book.
Yeah.
Which is something I seem to notice a lot from, I mean, I don't really want to generalize, but I seem to notice it more in like some translated South American literature that's, around this time period, because this book goes from 1975 to 1996. But there's a really charming section where he's just hanging out with, I think he's hanging out with either San Epifanio or Lucius Skin, and they're just like, they're like, you know what? Poets are gay, novelists are straight, and short story writers are bisexual. And then they like go into the different types of gays that the poets are. And it is the most charming conversation. And it's like a real conversation you would have with somebody in college. Like,
yeah, like this, this author would be a queen, or this author would be like a bottom or something. Yeah.
This author would be a fairy. Yeah. So charming. And it was just like a moment where I was just like, oh, like Bolaño has hung out with homosexuals. Like, it's charming. This entire section is charming, even though everything does go crazy in this section.
Yeah.
You leave off at the end of 1975. They become friends with this prostitute named Lupe, and she escapes her pimp, but the pimp is really scary.
Yeah, he has a huge knife. Yeah.
He has a huge knife that he measures his dick against.
Okay, so I wanted to just mention this. Parts of this I do think are a little like male fantasy-y, but I feel like having the prostitute with the knife penis is like, it's almost like, oh, this guy is like uber male or whatever. Like, he's like, and like Maduro's like, oh wow, like I'm just a little guy. Like I'm not a guy with a huge knife. So.
I'm a guy with a huge knife. And then they drive off into Sonora
to find the poet,
and to find Caesarea, and they take poor Quim. They take the sister's father is an architect who funds the literary magazine, and he like funds all of his money into it. He does not have like any money left from funding this literary magazine.
Oh yeah,
and they take his only car, and they escape.
Yeah, it's a real like we're busting out of Dodge kind of ending where like they just go tearing out of Mexico City essentially, like at the end.
And then he goes insane.
Yeah, so then things go crazy, because then suddenly we get immediately everyone is back from this trip that they've been on, and some interlocutor is interviewing people, as you said, and they're all explaining what happened immediately after they got back, basically. And it's everybody that's not Maduro or Lima or Bolaño.
Yeah. And then the only grounding, so the narrative winds all over the place in this middle section, and the only grounding one that you have is Amadeo Salvatierra, whose narrative, like whose interview is in January 1976. So right after they leave. And it's a really eerie, long narrative that just keeps popping back about Ulysses and Arturo, like trying to ask him about Caesarea and trying to see the only poem that she's ever published.
Yeah, they want to see
that's your only grounding point.
Yeah, they want to see the only poem they've ever published. They're like getting like continually drunk with him. There's a lot of just like the guy talking about like, oh, here's another shot of tequila. And there's that bit where he goes, a glass to which we have drunk mezcal out of that we're pouring tequila into is like a naked woman in furs or something, which is like a very funny saying. And then like it gets kind of like unsettling at times. Yeah. That's one thing we haven't talked about is I feel like Bolaño can do like David Lynch unsettlingness really well. And it pops up in this second section. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because they do Los Suicidas mezcal. Anyways, not important.
Have you ever had, you've had mezcal, right?
I like mezcal better than I like tequila. I hate tequila. But if there is a cocktail with a mezcal in it, for some reason, I really like that, even though mezcal is supposed to be lower than tequila.
Yeah, it's not as like refined. It's like more smoky and like, they make it in pits and like, This book and then Under the Volcano, which the epigraph this book is from, I read that immediately afterwards, and the main character is he only drinks mezcal, and so I was like, I gotta try this, and I was like drinking mezcal and being like, oh, my South American literature, I drink mezcal, and but yeah, it's like very, very like smoky, and I don't know, yeah, it was an interesting detail. So
yeah, I love mezcal. I hate tequila. I might not have just had any good quality tequila, but I don't like it.
Very possible.
The only time I've willingly done tequila shots is in the desert on the Mexican border.
Nice.
Which you kind of have to do.
Yeah.
Anyways, but yeah. And then for a while you're following like who you expect to follow. So like the other visceral realists.
What did you think of, I think early in the second section, there's that lady who goes, yeah, they did it all for me. I'm the cause
of it. God.
Yeah, like I'm the cause of the visceral realists. And then like later there's a guy who sees Bolaño, or maybe it's Lima, flirting with his girlfriend, and he's like, man, fuck Bolaño, like or something. Like he's like, man, like I hate that guy. Like there's this moment of like, oh, this guy's making my girlfriend, like he's flirting with my girlfriend, I hate him now. So
yeah, there is. Oh God, I don't remember what. Maybe it's Laura. But yeah, she's just like, they're so stuck up. They're just trying to look for attention, which I found hilarious, and I loved her. But yeah, she's in that beginning section, and then you kind of follow the original group of visceralists, and I kind of like it because you get to see what they're up to. Like their lives go on.
Yeah.
And then, so, yeah, they're in Mexico City for a little bit, and then they go to Europe. And when they go to Europe is when it starts kind of getting weird.
Yeah, Europe is, you were like talking about this in the group chat, like Europe is sort of like a continual failure and like horror show, like as they're there, like they're always like, they almost get killed at one point in Vienna. By like, and I don't remember why, or I don't know if it's Vienna.
Oh, like, it's Vienna.
Yeah, there's like that, like the insane German man or something. Like,
yes.
Like, yeah.
So, almost getting killed in Vienna. That is Hermito, who is possibly, I think, a neo-Nazi. That's what I picked up, is a neo-Nazi that Ulysses meets in Israel and goes to jail with, but then just decides to stick around with.
Oh, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back with Hermito to Austria. And then the like underground neo-Nazi group just tries to murder them a bunch of times. But Hermito's not good either. Ulysses makes somehow worse choices than Arturo.
Yeah, like isn't there one, is the thing about looking at the ground, because Lima found like $100 on the ground in Barcelona, so he's like walking around looking at the ground all the time. Like also, yeah. Like and an interesting theme develops in the second section where it's like authors in exile, and like Bolaño had fled Chile after Allende was deposed and Pinochet took over, and like for a while he was just in Barcelona, just like trying to write and work like odd service jobs. So like a lot of Savage Detectives, like if it wasn't already clear, it's even like more clear that it's drawn from his like experience just kind of being like an expat abroad.
Yeah, I think that's also another really interesting thing, because Arturo is clearly Bolaño.
Yeah.
That's not even, but like the way that the narrative treats Arturo and the things that happen, you just kind of like wonder like where the line blurs, because the line obviously blurs somewhere, and there's obviously like a difference between the fiction of the novel and like Roberto Bolaño's life, but it's so meshed in there. And the narrative is like everybody who like talks about Bolaño is like, that dude's scary. Like they're like, this dude sucks and he's scary.
Yeah, and he's always like doing weird things. Like there's this long sequence where he has to descend into that hole to like find somebody who fell down, and like it's implied that the hole is hell or something. like yeah. Yeah,
talk about Lynchian things that randomly pop up.
Yeah. And then like what else happens in the second bit? There's like an American woman who's sort of self-centered who takes the stage. I don't remember her name.
Oh, Barbara.
Yeah, Barbara. Yeah,
Barbara.
Classic Barbara behavior. Like, and she's kind of like self-centered. And also, I was going to mention this. There is one of the characters in Mexico who's considered to be like one of the mothers of Mexican poetry. You get her talking about how she locked herself in a bathroom during the 1968 like student massacre that happened. And he actually has like a book spin-off of just her section called Amulet. It's like 100 pages, but it's just like he basically broke that part off and like made it its own thing.
Okay, yeah. That section was kind of, the tone of that section was like very much the tone of the whole thing, where it's like, yeah, she locked herself in the bathroom, but it was just because she was reading a book in the bathroom already. And then she was like, well, I can't leave. And so she just sits in the bathroom and reads this book over and over and over again.
Yeah, like after the massacre, and sort of like she's there for like a week or two or something.
Yeah. But like some of the, well, yeah, because she's like, I can't leave. But the narrative doesn't necessarily like make her heroic. She's just like, yeah, I can't be found sitting on the toilet reading this book, but now I can't leave because how dare they? Yeah. There's just like some of the tragedy, there's always like a little line of comedy just kind of in there.
Yeah, that's also what's so great too. Is like, yeah, it can do horror and just psychological kind of insanity, but there's always kind of like a moment of sort of, like, I don't know, undercutting or self making fun of the person talking a little bit, like the person's making fun of themselves, something like that.
Yeah. And then I got pretty good at, so a lot of times when you start like reading a new section, you don't know who's going to show up. Is it going to be Arturo or is it going to be Ulysses?
Yeah.
And then like by halfway through the second section, I had like figured it out where I was like, okay, if the narrative starts and it's like really depressing and they're like, this is horrible, it's going to be Ulysses. And if the narrative starts out and you're like, how the fuck are they going to show up in this? It's Arturo. Like there's one section where it starts off like with this guy who like, it's in France. I think it's in France, who lives in these caves for free. And he's like a fisherman.
Okay.
And he lives in these caves and you're like listening to his narrative and you're like, and it's pretty early on in the Europe section. You're like, who is going to show up?
Yeah.
Who's going to show up in these caves or on this fishing boat? And it's Arturo. And there's another section that starts off with like these travelers who are hitchhiking and get picked up to go like work on this farm in Spain or something.
Is that when Bolaño's the night guard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, when Bolaño's the night guard. But like you were going through that section for quite a while and you're like, how is Arturo going to show up? And you never know. The same with the cave sequence is that goes on for quite a while and it's horrifying and it's lynchy and you're like, by that time you're like almost certain, like you're like, all right, where's Arturo? Like what?
Yeah, and also related to that cave section is to me one of my favorite fascinating character studies is like this self-centered guy who quotes Latin a lot and he thinks he's a poet. And he introduces himself as a poet, but crucially, he doesn't go down in the hole. And Bolaño is the one who goes down in the hole. And so you get this guy's like horrible, self-centered aggrandizement that's constantly like littered with Latin quotations from like Ovid and like Horace and like other like literary poets. And he's sort of like an asshole. And he's contrasted with, the anti-hero Bolaño, who's just kind of like a guy. And it should also be quoted that we're never given any of their poetry.
No, we're never giving any of their poetry.
We hear about it. It appears to be quite good, but we aren't presented with any of it ourselves.
Okay. The guy is also, I don't know if you remember this. The guy is really weird.
The Latin guy?
Yeah, the Latin guy. 'Cause like, so like, he invites Arturo like back with him.
Yeah.
and like implores Arturo, and then Arturo starts sleeping with one of his daughters.
Right.
And he catches them sleeping together once, and you would think once would be enough. But then it's like heavily implied / stated that he like just watches them have sex all the time.
Also, they have sex in what's
crazy.
Yeah, and they have sex in a really weird way too. Like, yeah.
It's like turning her around, flipping her around. And then he's just like, I'm going to destroy Arturo. And I think the funniest way that he decides to destroy Arturo is telling Arturo that he can publish poetry in his poetry magazine. That is his big plot to destroy Arturo, is you can publish poetry in my literary magazine now.
Yeah, he's gone insane from watching this happen multiple times. Oh, yeah, and there's that thing about money where he goes, money doesn't smell or something. Like, I remember he says that at one point. But
money doesn't smell. And then actually, so his daughter breaks up with Bolaño. There's a lot of weird. Okay. So usually Ulysses is described as just smelling awful all the time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of smell things, actually. But his daughter like breaks up with him because like she starts getting like really bad breath, and it's like it's implied that like she's getting really bad breath because Arturo reeks, and I guess she's just giving Arturo oral, and it just makes her breath smell bad, and she brushes her teeth like 6 times a day.
Yeah, so like like grimy kind of infection. Yeah.
Like we've stated, the sex stuff is weird in this book.
Yeah. Like, so it's almost like in several instances, it's like sex is like a portal to insanity for some people, or like darkness. Like it's something
Arturo.
Yeah, it's like something that's like, you know, obviously the character discovers it in the beginning and he's intrigued, but then like in the second section, it's like, yeah, it's like this portal to going slightly insane kind of. So
yeah, nobody who has sex in this book gets anything good out of it.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess Arturo gets a son and he loves his son, but nobody really benefits from sleeping with anyone. Nobody is really like stays in love. Nobody has a good relationship. It all falls apart, which everything falls apart, really.
Yeah, and in some way it kind of mirrors, like the dissolution of the poetry movement and kind of like everyone being forgotten and like, sex leading to kind of like breakups or insanity or something or obsession. Yeah.
Yeah. Which Arturo is the worst about. Every time Arturo is interested in somebody, it's like a full-on obsession. And it's like noted. They're like, yeah, he's really weirdly obsessed. And he does like a lot of crazy things.
Damn.
And every single time the girl is just like, you gotta go. I found Arturo the more interesting, but Ulysses is also really interesting. He's just so depressing. Yeah,
he's like the kind of the I don't know, the negative to the positive kind of, or like the down on the luck guy.
Yeah. Ulysses is weird the whole time through.
Yeah, there's kind of an interesting resonance with his name because, like, you know, Ulysses, Odysseus, the guy that leaves his home and has those adventures in the war and then comes back. But like, instead of being heroic, it's sort of like, there's a lot of like just horrible situations that he ends up in.
Yeah. Which I think it's implied that Ulysses Lima, like, his name isn't Ulysses Lima, but they never really say what his name is.
Yeah.
A few times they're like, that's not even his name, but nobody can actually tell you what his name is.
Yeah, it's like his pen name or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Ulysses is one that he just absolutely refuses to get a job. He goes to Israel for a while to see his lost love and hang out with some people. And then he goes back to Europe for a little while. He goes back to Europe with the neo-Nazi, and then he goes back to Mexico City. And when he goes back to Mexico City, and everybody who mentions is like, they're like, something is wrong with that dude. That dude is looking bad.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I don't remember this part. So everyone's like, oh, he looks really bad.
He looks really bad. Like, everything is bad. And then he gets invited to go to Guatemala by another poet who's just like, he's doing bad. Like, maybe this will be good for him. The absolute horror of that section, too, because he's just like, I can't believe I did this. And then Ulysses gets lost in Guatemala for a while. They just lose him.
Damn.
He just disappears, and they're like trying to leave, and they're like, I don't know where he is. And like, and they like kind of get in trouble with the Guatemalan police a little bit, but like, he's just lost. And then randomly at the end, he shows back up. He's in Mexico City, and it's actually that Octavio Paz runs into him.
Yeah, right. And isn't he like defeated? Octavio Paz is like defeated, right? Or something.
Yeah, well, they do some weird walking in circles thing, but Octavio Paz is like, yeah, I think that's the dude who like threatened to kill me, like kidnap me, kill me back in the 70s.
Yeah, because I remember like them like realizing that the two of them are both like old and dying, like as opposed to being like, oh, my enemy Octavio Paz. It's like, wow, we're getting old, aren't we, or something? Like it was, it's like this like moment of humanity or something after him being lost to the jungle or whatever.
And that was another like moment where Octavio Paz like has his secretary who's narrating, like, pull up a list of all the Mexican poets you can think of, and then she's like, what's your name? And he's like, Ulysses Lima. And she's like, you're not on my list anywhere, which is a very common theme.
Nobody knows you.
Nobody knows you. There's also a really horrible section right before that where they're at a literary festival in Spain, and they're talking to all the Spanish, like Mexican and Spanish like authors who made it, who are like and all of them are miserable. Like they made it. That was the thing. They made it. Like they're popular, they're published, they're being honored at this festival, and all of them are miserable. All of them are like, this wasn't really for anything. Like,
damn, yeah.
I was just like, okay.
Yeah, that reminds me, there's also a bit like that in 2666 where the academics are in love with somebody and they don't care about their work anymore. And they go to a conference and they look at all the grad students, and all the grad students are just zombies that are reciting "Love me, let me love you" over and over again. And they're like horrified. They're like, oh, like, no more. It's like, like making it is somehow not as, it doesn't compare. So,
yeah. And then, do you remember where we left off with Arturo? Because that section is very interesting.
I don't think so.
So Arturo shows up in Africa. Well, okay.
Is that when he's like looking at a book of poets? Does he do that?
No.
Okay.
I think that's earlier.
Okay.
So Arturo is settled in Spain. He's published a novel. He has a son. He has a wife. He has an ex-wife. And then he's going to publish his second novel. And he gets into a sword fight with a critic who hasn't even reviewed his novel yet. He's just like, he's going to write a bad review. He's going to write a bad review. And he's like, we have to have a duel. And his friend's just like, excuse me? He's like, we have to have a duel. And so they have this duel with like sabers on a nudist beach. And he makes this nurse that slept with him just like watch from the distance. He's like, I'm leaving for Africa. You have to meet me at this beach, but you're not going to meet me. You're just going to watch.
my doomed quest. Yeah, like I have to recover my lost youth by fighting this critic.
And then he goes to Africa, and the section is horrific. I think it's like one of the last ones in that second section, but it's implied that he's like dead.
Oh, wait, really? Shit, I don't remember that. Like, he maybe died in Africa?
Yeah. So it follows a journalist. The journalist is the one who's being interviewed. And they get... I don't remember if they said what the country was. And I feel bad about that. Anyways. They're in an African country. I don't think they say which one it is. And so they go, and it's being torn apart by revolution, which is why everyone's there. The main city is called Monrovia.
Okay.
And this is just my ignorance.
Yeah, I'm going to look it up real quick because now I'm curious.
Yeah,
Monrovia.
It's not Liberia.
Oh, it is Liberia. It's capital.
It is Liberia. Yeah. Oh, okay. So it goes to Liberia. So yeah, we end up in Liberia. Liberia is under revolution. They're in Monrovia. And this journalist goes to like different sections. They go to like several different countries in Africa. And he just happens to run into Bolaño every single time. And Bolaño is like, wants to die, but he doesn't want to die. Bolaño is like in poor health. He's like really worried about his medications, but he wants to like get killed in Africa, basically.
Yeah, he wants to have a heroic death as opposed to dying and with his family, essentially.
Dying with his family or dying from pancreatitis.
Which I believe he actually had, Roberto Bolaño.
I think he did. As an offshoot about like, you know, like the real life and the fiction of it, there is a sort of respect there where we don't actually ever meet his ex-wife.
Yeah.
She's just mentioned. Like, he does not fictionalize her. And his son is mentioned, and only just that he loves his son so much. His son is also not fictionalized. And I feel like that's like a step of respect there.
Yeah, like I'm doing the past, not like, whatever my present is or like my family.
Yeah. Anyways, so they go to Liberia. It's in revolution, and Bolaño shows up in this outpost. Not outpost, but like in this town that's being rocked by revolution. And soldiers from one side are going to march on the capital and overthrow. It's a revolution. And it's just, but there's also an option to go around another path to get back to the capital, to get out of the country that will not end in death.
Okay.
And at the last moment, Bolaño decides to go with the revolutionaries to an almost certain death. And the narrative leaves it like you do not know, because they don't actually know what happened with this battle, like who won, who died. It seems like both the generals died, but they don't know who has control. And they're asking like somebody who allegedly knows what's going on, like what happened. And all he says was just like, you know, everyone's dead. Peace reigns in Black Creek. And just nobody knows what happens. And like, that is where we leave Arturo.
Wow. Yeah. probably died trying to do a hero's death. Yeah. Leaving his family behind. Yeah.
Decided to die in the revolution.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because like you know, if we're gonna place it with the biographical reading, it's like Bolaño finally started writing prose to support his family. He did like have failing health, so a lot of his last years were spent trying to crank out as much as possible to ensure that his family had like money to live on. And so it's interesting that he's like, when he writes Savage Detectives, he's imagining himself like leaving it all behind for some like heroic in quotes death, like, and then like, you know, not staying essentially. And that's an interesting sort of like, projection of, I guess, like maybe him like being like, oh, my youth is over, like now I have to be an adult or something. I don't know. So
yeah, I'm thinking about that section a lot still, and I haven't decided what I want to make of it.
There's also a short story that I can find that's just Arturo Bolaño in Africa, like looking at a book of poets, and it's like he went back to that scene and like imagined something else happening. that I can't remember what it's called, but I'll try to find it. But I think he revisited the sort of guy lost in a foreign country, making a decision type vibe. So
did Bolaño go to Africa?
I don't think so. I know he went to Barcelona and in Europe, but I don't know if he actually went to Africa. I could be wrong.
Yeah. That was a question I had when I finished the section and did not look up. That was also when I stopped breathing and just started reading. I think I spent 2.5 hours just sucked into the ending of this book, which is rare. That never happens. Not even looking at my phone.
Well, yeah, because it's you I don't know, you want to know what happens to these characters. It's you follow all this time with them, and you sort of see this movement blossom and then die. So it's this you want to see how everything ends up.
Yeah. Which I guess we can talk about the end.
Yeah. So
there's stuff we're missing that's really good, but
one last thing I'll say about section 2 is I do like the sort of doomed academics, because as we were mentioned earlier, or not the doomed, the grim academics that we mentioned earlier, because they don't know the whole story, but we kind of do, the reader. So there's a nice sort of friction between this academic at the end accounting for the visceral realists and forgetting to bring up Madura and getting other things wrong. And we know what happened, or most of it, not all of it, because we still need part 3, but we know the majority of what happened. So there's a nice sort of these people won't understand this group of people. So.
Yeah. And I think the interview structure is so brilliant. Just because it allows the narrative to keep going and for you to keep track of all these characters, but when you want to, and you can give little tidbits. But I think if the second section had been written just as a traditional narrative, I think it would be unreadable.
Yeah, just and then we went to this country, and then we went to that country.
Yeah. And and then this happened, and then this happened. It almost solves I'm just man, this could solve writer's block. If you just set it up as an interview, you don't have to think of a concise plot. You can just write all the scenes that you want to write in the interview.
Yeah, and to me that this book also got me really interested in polyphonic novels where the characters get to speak in their specific ways, and the story is the interaction between the two rather than here's the narrator telling everything that happens. I think I told you I wrote a short story that was me trying to do the Bolaño thing with in terms of voices. So I think you're right. I think it's almost a productive way of approaching a story as just people talking or people getting interviewed.
Yeah. I just think it's a brilliant narrative style. I'm sure somebody else has done it, but it's the first time I've encountered it this style specifically. I'm just it's brilliant. Because you can jump around time too,
Yeah, and I think there's actually a poetic precedent for it. Did you ever read the poem "My Last Duchess" by Robert Browning?
Maybe a long time ago.
It
sounds familiar, but I can't remember.
It's a poem. Robert Browning was, I guess he didn't write entirely free verse, but he was one of the first guys to write poems as dramatic monologues, where the poem is just one character speaking. And I think I don't know if there's there's probably some antecedents or something, but to me, Bolaño being a poet, it's probably what if I just wrote a novel that was all dramatic monologues, and that's, and obviously they're being interviewed, so it's not a clear monologue, but the idea that if you get a character talking, that's the plot basically, as opposed to now I need to get them to this country. Now I need to get to that country. It's just oh, they're there. What are they doing when they're there? Something like that. So, but yeah, I don't know. It's a really great technique. And I think it's, like you were saying, kind of endlessly productive, because he could have just kept adding stuff in the second section. But instead he kind of closes it back with we return to Maduro in part 3.
Yeah. Caesarea.
So they go to the Sonoran Desert and they find Cesaro, and they don't really get any answers from her.
No.
Yeah, there's no answers. She gets tragically killed. There's a couple of parts in that section that hint at 2666 as if she is like in a premonition like way aware of all of the women who will be killed mysteriously in Sonora, the feminicides. But she doesn't really explain why it happens. She just kind of says it sort of like, prophet like or prophetess like. And then I sort of detected like Maduro finally becoming like a bohemian bum poet after witnessing this happen. Like he sort of gets his full maturity.
Yeah, well, they just move into her house. Like,
Yeah.
she gets shot. Bolaño and Lima take the
doesn't
bodies.
Bolaño shoot the prostitute? I just remembered that.
No.
Oh, who shoots? Well, not the prostitute. Sorry, the pimp. I keep saying that. Yeah.
Bolaño stabs the pimp with a knife, which Bolaño's knife had been hinted at quite a few times, and I think used a couple of times in the second section.
Damn, okay.
He was really, that's part of the how he makes himself out to be really scary and unsettling. Is that every once in a while in the second section they'll get in a situation and Bolaño will just whip out this knife and whoosh. So yeah, he kills the pimp with the knife that he bought in Sonora.
Yeah.
They there's, I think it's just one of the day's entries is just Bolaño bought a knife. It's very sinister. Pretty sure it's pretty early on. They think about the pimp coming. So yeah. And then Ulysses tries to kill the cop. I think they shoot the cop. I think the cop's not all the way dead.
Oh damn, okay.
I think they shoot the cop. And then Bolaño and Lima take the bodies and bury them somewhere. And then Madero and Lupe, who is the prostitute, just move into Cesaro's house for a little while. And the entire it's a very small town, but the entire town just doesn't really say anything about it.
What happened? Yeah.
What happened? They just kind of move into her house for a little while and then they leave. Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, and then they just kind of go driving, and then the entries are just lists of cities, right?
Yeah, the entries, they're just lists of cities, and then it gets into the I guess pictographs. I don't know what these are technically called. These little drawing puzzles.
And maybe Cesaro's only poem is also one of them.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's one thing we haven't talked about. Yeah, what did you think of the pictographs? I still don't think I actually know what's going on with those. The poem that we're treated to, her only poem, which is kind of why they want to go find her, is a pictograph of waves getting more and more intense and a boat on them.
It's a flat line with a rectangle on it, and then it's a wavy line with a rectangle on it, and then it's a pointy, very pointy, jagged line with a rectangle on it. And that part was really interesting because Amadeo, who was Cesaro's friend who they're interviewing and who gets more and more unsettled, is I have no idea what this poem means. I don't know. It haunts me. I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
It's a mystery. And Ulysses and Arturo are just I know what this poem means, and I maybe saw this when I was a kid. And then it's one of the few very interesting times, which is really delightful to read, where they sit down and they break down the poem, which they do with the vampire poem too. They sit down and they break down the poem line by line.
Yeah.
To explain what it means. And then the pictograms come back in the last section. And so the book ends with like a very mysterious, because all the pictograms have their solutions written under them up until the last page.
Right.
And you end with the pictogram asking, what's outside the window.
Yeah, and it's a dotted line box. And it's just a dotted line box. There's nothing in it, and the question just says, "What's outside the window?" And that's how it ends.
That's how it ends. Filled me with absolute dread. I was just like, oh.
Yeah. Okay. So we were talking earlier, and Anna had the kind of dread-filled reading. It's like what is left outside, and I kind of read it a little more hopefully, and I was like, what's outside the window? It's like you could put the book down now and like think about your life, and like there's a life that goes on that's not just doomed poets and like literature readings and like misadventures in Europe, like what do you do now, kind of. And but that's like the more hopeful reading. But I think also the dread reading is like there isn't anything outside the window, or like what's outside the window is like a horror.
Yeah, which I like your hope-filled reading. And I think both can be true because that's kind of a theme. But I think I just read this last part so fast and it was so horrific.
Like it suddenly like everything just cuts off, kind of like
everything cuts off because it was like I feel like this context is important. I started with the bit where Arturo goes to Africa.
Oh yeah.
And then I read the rest of the book through and there's nothing happy.
So you think like reading it that way, it's like Maduro's gonna die somewhere. Like that's what's left for him, kind of.
I don't even think he's gonna die somewhere. I just think that like he's totally untethered at the end. Like he doesn't really know what he's gonna do.
Yeah.
He's not going back to Mexico City.
Right.
And he doesn't like publish any poetry. And at the end, they're just driving to, it's just lists of towns. They're just driving around because they don't feel like being in Caesaria's house anymore.
Yeah.
But there's just nothing. Because they're still contemplating the fact that like 3 people died. Like,
right.
We killed 2 guys and we accidentally killed Caesario. Like,
I remember thinking that like when they get back from this in part 2, it seemed like something went horribly wrong. And so like, and I think like you could kind of read it as like the deaths of those people went horribly wrong. So now like they're kind of just scattered to the winds, and like anything that they try to do is going to end up in like failure. It's like some sort of like, I don't know, curse or something, something like that.
Yeah. It felt like the section answered a question for me too, because in the second section, so in the first section, Arturo and Ulysses are inseparable. They're often like referred to as one unit and people are creeped out by it.
Yeah.
Like they share one brain, and then like in the second section, they don't seem to be all that close to each other. And really, honestly, Ulysses falls off the map and Arturo doesn't even like notice. Arturo like helps Ulysses out like once, and then Arturo never mentions Ulysses again. Ulysses never really mentions Arturo again. They don't see each other ever again. And you can sense it like in the second section. You can like sense the moment where like everything is changing. Like even before Caesarea is like killed, you can sense it. Kind of answers the question of why they aren't even close anymore. Just something breaks in them because they spend a month like driving around.
Damn. And yeah, and maybe the thing that breaks is like, that they killed people, and like that's sort of like as worse as your adventure can go is that you end up killing someone. So
yeah. Because they spend like a month on this wild goose chase around Sonoria. And then there's a critical moment where like the pimp is starting to show up. And they're like, we should just give up. And Arturo's like, well, we can't give up. And it's like this critical like point where like Ulysses just wants to give up and go home. Arturo does not.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then they kill people. And that might ruin anybody's time.
Right. So yeah, it's like the tragedy or the curse or like the doomed like and then it all just kind of falls apart in various ways after that. It is not clear what Madero's going to do after. Yeah, he just kind of aimlessly drives around with Lupe.
He aimlessly drives around, and then the second part, because that was something I definitely thought about while I was reading the second part. I was like, where the fuck is Madero?
Yeah.
And that kind of also explains why maybe Madero just disappeared in Sonora. We don't really know. We have no idea.
And you could, like, with the allusion to 2666, sort of read it as like that's the horrible thing at the end of the tunnel, because he kind of, I wouldn't say all of his stuff is about that, but there is a sort of an emphasis on like why were all these women killed, like what's causing this, like what's the horrible like core to this thing, but I don't think, like, I think it's more like an illusion rather than like something that explains Savage Detectives. It's more like a pointer or something. Yeah,
I probably have to read 266 next, but
I mean, it is awesome. There is just a lot of it. It's like, it's quite a big, it's I think a little bit bigger than Savage Detectives, but there's like even more like weird things that happen and like styles that are like picked up and dropped and stuff. So
yeah. I think that's probably succinct. I don't know. That might be all my reaction.
Oh, well, I have one last question if we want to do the last one. Actually, I'll split it into well, we already did the window one. Yeah, the last question is, who are the Savage Detectives? So it's never actually stated in the book who they are, and the name is the Savage Detectives. Do you have any idea? I have a theory, but what do you think?
Two minds. The first answer that comes to my head is just like, well, Ulysses and Arturo. Yeah. In the first and last, they are really trying to look for Caesarea. But then I kind of kept wondering, like, who was conducting all these interviews? Like, who is actually tracking all this down over all of this time? Because there's not really a character that's not interviewed except for Madero, but Madero could not have possibly interviewed Amadeo in January, but
right, because he was like, driving around or something. He was
driving around, but like because it's like, too, like, it feels like somebody is trying to be a detective to put together Arturo and Ulysses' life. But also Ulysses and Arturo are... And it gets, like, really deep into, like, the detectivery to find Caesarea once they get into Sonora. They are, like, going to towns. They're reading public records. They are going to random people's houses, like...
Yeah, like, looking at maps and stuff as well, I think. Yeah.
Looking at maps, looking at tombstones, talking to bullfighters, talking to teachers, getting kicked out of libraries because Arturo doesn't have his papers and he's in Mexico illegally.
Yeah. So on one hand, it could be Arturo and Ulysses. On the other hand, it could be whoever's conducting the interviews. I also I want to get a little corny and say it's kind of the readers in the second part, because like you're the ones kind of putting together the interviews to kind of like see if you can see this picture of something that would be like hard to visualize otherwise. Like, this group of people and like their kind of travels across the globe in reaction to like multiple things happening. Yeah. Also, I would say in doing that, you kind of account for like the story of their lives, which is like kind of treated as seriously as their poetry, which is like referred to, but never like, presented exactly.
Yeah. I like that. Okay. One last thing I just also thought of. The marketing on the book for the book is so off. It was like cracking me up. 'Cause like, they're like, oh, it's like it's like a oh my gosh, give me 2 seconds. Don Quixote-esque journey to like do all this stuff, like two modern day Don Quixotes. I'm like, this is nothing like Don Quixote.
Yeah.
Not even close. Who wrote this? Like,
Yeah, that is sort of, and also like, yeah, it's I don't. I mean, it's like, oh, what is an English audience going to think? Like, oh, a Spanish guy on a doomed quest,
yeah, like nothing. I always like to see what things are going to get compared to, and usually I ignore it. I'll only occasionally like, do it if it's like, one time I was looking at back a book and they compared it to a Calvino, and I was like, oh, like a random name.
Yeah, the Vince McMahon like interested meme.
Yeah,
yeah.
I was like, where did you pull out Calvino from? And also, I love Calvino, but like all of the blurbs on this book do not seem to like capture at all like, I feel like they were afraid to like be like how dark this book was, but like, I don't know. I'm just very mad that like the official like summary of this book just says two modern day Quixotes. I'm like, this is not.
Yeah, because like
I just read Don Quixote. This is not.
Yeah, because like the only thing I can see is like, oh, they're I don't know.
They're traveling.
They're traveling.
Spanish.
They're idealistic. They speak Spanish. They've read too much. But like at the same time, like there's, something kind of, comic, heroic about Don Quixote that's like, this is more like doomed and sort of, tragic. Like, sure, there is comedy, heroicness to it. But like the fact that Bolaño fights that critic to prevent dying with his family is like tragic.
That might be the only Don Quixote-esque moment in that book, actually, thinking about it.
Yeah,
that is
like,
very Don Quixote.
Yeah, because Quixote starts fighting probably because starts becoming a knight probably because his life is so boring. Is what it's alluded to kind of in the beginning of Don Quixote. Like he's just so bored that he wants to become a knight errant, and and there is kind of like the doomedness to Bolaño trying to fight that critic.
The fight scene for the critic is also like presented in such stark, because it's a very silly scene, but it's in like such stark horror. Like the guy the entire time was like, this is the most horrific thing that's ever happened. It was so uncomfortable. I couldn't even like light a cigarette. Like we were just stuck there and it was horrific. And these poorly health like 40-year-olds are trying to cut each other with sabers and somebody's gonna get hurt.
Yeah, it's like
such deadpan horror. Like
yeah, it's like from Bolaño's perspective, he's probably like, oh, this is awesome. But yeah, everyone is just like, these two old men are fighting. like one of them may die. So. But yeah, so any closing thoughts? I would say definitely one of my favorites of all time, I think. And I like that it, as we've kind of been saying, like takes sort of reading and writing and making stuff seriously, but also is like, this is sort of like a doomed enterprise. Like, why would anyone embark on a career of doing this? Like what's going on here? But like, it still takes it super seriously. And like Bolaño can also do like funny and horrifying and sort of psychologically unnerving really equally. And that mix of moods and sort of arc is like, I don't know, it's just like catnip to me. So
yeah, definitely probably going to be a favorite of all time.
Oh, hell yeah. I'm glad to hear it.
Anyone that I was talking to, I tried to talk to people about this novel who were not reading this novel, and I was like, but this funny section, I like also tried to recommend this novel to like 16 people, especially my mom, who's a poet. And I was just like, you have to read it.
What did your mom say? Now I'm curious.
I don't know. I think she just said okay, but I'm done with it now and I own this one, so I'm probably going to try to force my mom to read it.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what she thinks about it, because your mom definitely knows what's up about what's good to read and what's not. So it'd be interesting to hear what she says.
Yeah. But yeah, I tried to suggest to like anybody I knew that like sort of did writing or like anything. Like just like 1,000 times I was reading it over and over again. I was like, you got to read this.
I was at a party and I was talking about Bolaño with like a Puerto Rican guy and a guy from Italy, and I was like, this is a very Bolaño-esque experience. Is that like just 3 different nationalities are all like talking about this one author that they like a whole lot, and I was like, I am in heaven right now. So they really liked him, but like the Puerto Rican guy associated him more with like youthfulness for some reason, I guess because he had read him when he was younger, like in Spanish, but he sort of had this sort of like, oh man, I haven't read Bolaño in years. And then the Italian guy was like, yeah, he's pretty great. And what did he tell me? I can't remember. He told me something about Bolaño that I've now forgotten, but like it was a nice mix of people talking about it. It was pretty awesome. So
yeah, the one thing that I regretted while I was reading it, I was like, man, I didn't do enough when I was doing my creative writing degree. I hated those people.
Well, I mean,
couldn't hang out with them.
There's still time. Like,
there's still time.
Yeah.
I know. I could start writing again. But I was just like, man, I didn't get to sit in 24-hour cafes and talk about literature. I just was in a weird building and dudes drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon.
Be like, I hate this guy, or whatever.
I hate this guy, or they're like, what about like name dropping as many people as they could? Which, to be fair, they do in this one too.
Right? Yeah. See, it's like a thing you do to show that you're well read. You're like, oh, this, that, I know this. You know, like, yeah.
But also by the end of the book, I'm like, thank God I did biology. I could be a miserable author.
A miserable author. I'm working some horrible job. No one has read any of my work. Yeah, like.
Anyways.
Yeah.
10 out of 10.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, definitely going to the Infinite Library for sure. So.
Yep.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.